So anxiety is becoming something that's more and more prevalent. People are dealing with it more, especially in today's age with the dawn of social media, smartphones, and comparison only exacerbate this feeling of anxiety, especially for young adults. You know, we're dealing with more and more anxious thoughts and situations in this confusing and fast-changing world. But what is anxiety? What is it? Is it just a buzzword? And how do we manage it? And so that's what we're going to be talking about and unpacking in today's episode of the JC podcast. Welcome to the JC podcast, a place where we get to unpack and explore life topics in a confusing and fast-changing world. I'm your host, James, and this is our 11th episode for the JC podcast. So thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Today, we're talking about all things anxiety. Now, according to Beyond Blue, 3 million Australians are living with anxiety. Anxiety is the most common mental health condition in Australia, and 1 in 4 people will experience anxiety at some stage in their life. According to the ABS, which is the Australian Bureau of Statistics, between 2020 and 2022, 13.3% of males and 21.1% of females had anxiety. And almost 1 in 3 people aged between 16 to 24 years had a 12-month anxiety disorder. That's according to the ABS. So anxiety is very much prevalent in our society. And Inside Out 2, which I don't know if you've seen, screened in cinemas a few months ago, and one of the main characters was anxiety. And so I think it's something that we should talk about and something that we need to talk about, anxiety. And so today, to talk about that, we have a special guest on the podcast who I think is the perfect person to do that. She's someone that I've only just gotten to know in the past few months, but I've already gotten to know her and spend time with her. She's a trained counsellor. She has her own side business with that. She has a graduate diploma of counselling and integrated psychotherapy. She's also a very good administrator as well. She's kind, she's genuine, she's sensitive, and she's a great friend. So please welcome to the JC podcast, Sarah Clarke.
Yay.
Welcome.
Thank you, James. So great to be here.
Today?
I'm doing really well. What a kind intro.
Like I like to do this. What kind of emoji would you use to describe how you feel today?
Oh, today. Okay, so I might be going off on an aeroplane to Bali later
In a few
today.
hours.
So I think my emoji would be the one that's like the party emoji. That's like blowing out the
Yeah, 100%.
That would be me today, with maybe a side. I mean, I can never just do one emoji. I'm that kind of person. So there'll definitely be the island emoji, the sun emoji, and the see you later, everybody, aeroplane
just
emoji.
Having fun on my holiday. Yeah.
Cannot wait.
So obviously, I think not a lot of people, a lot of my listeners at least, would know you. No. So why don't you just introduce a bit about yourself?
Yeah.
What you currently do. What does life look like for you at the moment? And maybe like, what's a fun, weird fact about you?
Okay, I love that. Well, it's James. So great to be here. For those, probably everyone who's listening wouldn't know who I am, but I'm Sarah Clarke. As James said, I've got a private practice in counselling for the last 5-6 years now. It brings me so much joy. It's so great to be able to work in the private practice, working with people who are struggling with some mental health or anxious symptoms. In my spare time, I love to, I'm an auntie. I've got 9 nieces and nephews, and they keep me so busy.
Wow. Yep.
I work really hard to try to be the favourite auntie because I'm up against some tough competition. So that takes up a lot of my time. A fun fact about me, okay, here's one that not many people know, is that as well as being a counsellor, I'm also a trained tap dancing teacher.
Oh, really?
So if anybody wants to do some tap dancing as a way of dealing with anxiety, maybe that can be my niche going forward. Yeah.
If you want it, that's I never knew that. That's so great.
I mean, I'm surprised it doesn't come up in conversation all the time.
How did that happen? Like,
tap dancing. Oh, growing up, since I was in kinder, we were put into ballet lessons, which turned into tap dancing lessons, and I did tap for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really fun.
That's so interesting.
Still comes back. I kind of want to do it again a little more, actually.
So interesting. I've never met a tap dancer before, so.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, hello.
Now I know one. Thanks for introducing yourself. So I guess for those listening, a bit about how I know Sarah. So kind of crash course. We just met, was it probably over 2 months ago-ish.
Yeah, in June.
Yeah. June, was it June? Oh, it is June. Yeah, so maybe 3 months.
Final week of June.
And if you've been following my podcast, she was one of the people who I went with to KL,
Woohoo!
to the ARG Upper Regional Gathering. So we spent about a week together. Also happened to be attending the same church during my sabbatical. So shout out to Flow Church. And yeah, as I've interacted with Sarah, she's just been, so genuine. She just really cares. And she's so attentive. And so, given her skills as a counsellor, I think and specialising in anxiety, I think she'd be the really great person to bring this topic to light. So I'm really excited to jump into this topic because I know a lot of you guys really want to hear about this because so many people struggle with it. So, and I guess for the benefit of everyone who's listening and watching. So I think today we want to just cover what stuff about anxiety, just some practical tips and help for people who are going through anxiety and some just practical stuff. Also about how does anxiety work with our faith?
Yeah.
And and then just Sarah as a professional counsellor, she's going to give an insight at how she kind of approaches her counselling sessions. But maybe just define what is anxiety? Yeah.
Anxiety is really interesting, and it's often connected to, we look at stress as well. So you've got stress and anxiety. Both these feelings of stress and anxiety are very normal. They can actually be a protective mechanism at times for us as well, especially when we're I'm feeling nervous, worried about something, and then it helps us put in that, before you're public speaking, say you're public speaking before 5,000 people, which I've never done and I hope to never do. You feel that sense of nervousness beforehand, a little bit like some low-level anxiety, which then causes you, I think, to really spend time taking it seriously, putting in all the work, hopefully, to then have that result of being able to speak in front of all these people. But it can also be unhealthy, right? And I think that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's more when anxiety presents itself in an unhealthy way or a way that doesn't feel controllable by us, can often present, if we think about our body, with muscular tension, increased heart rate, we can feel that our heart is beating a bit faster, those feelings of butterflies or nervousness. It presents differently in different people. I think connected to, if we think about our thoughts, often thoughts that are extremely worried about the future, coming up with scenarios and ideas of what is going to happen and the pain that is to come. And then as we think about those thoughts, it then feeds into how our body feels as well. And then it becomes this awful cycle of the thought saying, hey, this terrible thing's going to happen. Your body's like, oh, imagine if that happens, I'm going to feel awful. Oh, I'm feeling awful, it must happen. Okay, this is further confirms that this is something that's going to happen. And so I guess to summarize, anxiety would be really characterized by worry, nervousness, from the little to the really extreme about things that haven't happened and may not happen as well.
I guess what do you think is a common misconception that people have surrounding anxiety that I'm sure you've heard when people bring up anxiety? What's a common thing?
I think a lot of people feel like they should just be able to snap out of it because partly they can recognize there's an irrational nature to their anxiety. And so there can become, I would say, a shame that's connected to it because they're like, well, I should be better than this. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I think also for those who haven't struggled with anxiety, it can be really hard to, I've got some friends who are like, for example, I get a bit of anxiety when I travel on the aeroplane. I don't really love heights. And so I do have to prepare myself beforehand. And on the aeroplane, this will be me later this afternoon, feel a little bit concerned. And I've got a friend who's like, oh yeah, I know that the plane can crash, but then I just decide not to think that. And he's fine. And so I think that can be partly the root of the misconception that some people are able just to put those thoughts aside and find it really easy, whereas others find it really difficult. And I think it's connected to because of how much you can feel it in the body and then this mind and the mind-body connection is really strong and powerful during anxiety.
So then, I guess, you mentioned there's a comparison aspect to it because it's almost like, oh, other people can just flick it off. Why can't I? I guess maybe share how much of that comparison aspect feeds into the anxiety. I don't know, like, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, James, because I think what I see, and perhaps people can relate to this as well, is when people are experiencing anxiety, sometimes they can experience anxiety about their anxiety. So they find themselves heightened and they're feeling anxious about something. And then it can be that person's not feeling this way. They're like doing that comparison thing. And then they're like, it can turn into, well, then what's wrong with me that I'm feeling anxiety? And then it's that double layered anxiety that comes out. So I think that can be really hard for people as well, and make them feel even more perhaps ashamed or embarrassed that they are struggling.
I guess like we'll go into like how anxiety manifests in different ways. And so I think, especially watching Inside Out, which I think a lot of people said, like mental health people said it was like really good, because I know you haven't watched it.
I still haven't watched it.
But I think a lot of mental health professionals said that it was actually a really good representation of anxiety. And so what the main thing is that anxiety is just trying to protect Riley, who is the main human character. But like anxiety just overdoes it, just way too much overthinking. But it comes from a good place of like, we need to protect her. And so that's what we clearly see in Inside Out too. But in terms of like anxiety and what we experience, like what are some common examples of anxiety that you have, that you know of, or that people have, come to you for, and how often do they present and manifest?
Like their symptoms of anxiety.
Yeah. So like common ones, and then like how what does that look like for that person? Yeah, usually. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely need to go see Inside Out 2. I've seen number 1, maybe while I'm...
Inside Out 2 is good.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see that, and I would agree with what you've just shared about the way anxiety is presented. And often I like to, when we're talking about anxiety, I guess in the therapeutic setting, it is this thing that anxiety is trying to protect you. It's trying to keep you from harm, trying to keep you from feeling emotional pain. And the way that it does that is it will often go, hey, be careful, this may happen, and don't do it, and this way you'll be safe from the pain. And so there is an element of our body is and our mind is trying to protect us, and to not be frustrated or angry with ourselves about that, but instead show ourselves compassion and this like, thank you, body, that you're trying to protect me. The analogy I often use in the therapeutic setting too is that of, I don't know, James, you might be better cook than me. Sometimes my toaster will burn toast, and this sets off the smoke alarm.
Yeah.
I hear the smoke alarm going off. My first reaction is not to call up 000, get the fire brigade over and say, the smoke alarm's going off, I need help, come over straight away. Instead, what I do is I see the smoke alarm is going off. I see the smoke coming out of the toaster.
Yeah.
I put 2 and 2 together. I'm like, okay, it's the toaster that set off the smoke alarm. I don't need to call the fire brigade, and I can get my tea towel and just like wave it about until the fresh air can stop the smoke alarm from misfiring. And I think anxiety can often be similar to that. But before we learn how to treat it, often we hear the smoke alarm within our body and we go straight to the extreme. The house is burning down. There's an emergency that's going to happen. And so, I think that can be a really helpful analogy to remember. So often in therapy, what we're doing is helping people hear the smoke alarm and then assess what is actually going on and what response do I need to have, what response do I need to give. Okay, of course, if you're about to fall down a cliff, you run away. But perhaps it's just that the thought is misfiring there and anxiety is coming to the surface. In terms of, I guess, what I see with clients, it's interesting. Personally, from what I've seen, a lot of anxiety seems to be connected to pain points of the past, such as their teenage years or during childhood.
Yep.
They've experienced some kind of pain, and as a result of that pain, their body, in their childlike way or teenage-like way, has tried to come up with a solution to stop them from ever feeling that pain again. And then out of that pain, so for example, someone who may have been bullied as a teenager, decides, I never want to go through that again. And they come up with a rule, which is like, okay, I'm just going to be nice to everybody, or I'm never, whatever the rule may be. But there's often a core identity piece connected to that as well, which is often, this is what I often see pretty much in all cases, there's a core identity piece that's been formed as a result of pain that's often, I'm not good enough, no one will love me, or, just these very harsh, generalized kind of statements. And as a result, they live their life with that kind of thought, and that then creates some anxiety in the future. So they might go into a new social situation and their brain clicks back into, okay, everyone might not like me here, and then they feel nervous and it feels really overwhelming, and how do I cope with this social situation? The other thing is, so that's where anxiety gets present, is really around the future situations as well. So in that example, I've got a party coming up. Okay, I've got a new job. I've got to do this. How am I going to cope with that when I'm so aware of how painful it's been in the past? How do I protect myself from that? There's obviously phobias and things as well, such as, flying or spiders or, different things like that. But it's majority of the clients I'm seeing, it's much more connected to some core identity pieces.
Oh, yeah. And I guess like when it's so ingrained in you, it's like what's like that kind of first step to try to tackle that? Like when it's so, because like, for example, I can really resonate with, and I shared on the podcast before, like the feeling of like, I'm not good enough, which definitely comes, I think, from childhood. But it's just like, because you've owned that identity for so long, what is often the first step that you encourage people to try to combat that?
I mean, that's a great insight you've had there, James. Is that one you've come to recently?
Probably I've known, I think I've had it lingering for like a few years, but it really came to light when I hit burnout. I was just like, why have I hit burnout? And I think one of the things was just like, trying to pursue like I think with feeling I'm not good enough comes with like people pleasing, kind of like perfectionistic tendencies and stuff like that, which leads to burnout if it's not controlled. Yeah,
that's a really, really powerful insight to have. And once you have it, it is a bit like a light bulb goes on, and you're like, oh, I can see how long I've been carrying this for, and the way that it does impact how you live out your day to day and how you interact with people. It's quite amazing, isn't it? The way that it does have that.
Yeah, just that insight. Yeah, but it still feels like it's so hard to change something that's been there. Yeah.
And that's where, I mean, I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and there's many different forms of it. But the general premise is being able to identify irrational or untrue core beliefs or thoughts that we hold and restructure them so that they are true or rational. And if we, I guess, go that one step further, for those of faith as well, it's this, taking captive the thoughts and making them obedient to Christ Jesus. And so you asked, how do we actually restructure some of those? It can definitely be done by yourself, but there's something about in the therapeutic setting about being able to do some of the restructuring of thoughts that's really helpful, to have a trained professional help you restructure, because it's often the way I guess I would approach it in session with clients is we look at when it first happened, and we look at, you said it was probably in childhood, I think. We look at child James and what was going on and how that thought came to be about. And often when you look at it from your adult perspective, you can see the where, I call it a rule for life. You've developed a rule for life as a child, which is, you say it again, what was yours? James
like, I'm not good enough.
James is not good enough. I'm not good enough. This rule for life that was developed that you have then lived out in your teenage and adult years. Look back and to see when it happened. Look at childlike James. What was happening? Zooming out from the situation, because as a child, we can only see it from one perspective. We don't have the capabilities as we do as an adult to see it from many different perspectives. So we bring our adult lens to it. Okay, what else was happening? what was happening in that person or that other person? What's happening in the situation to have child James come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
And is this the same conclusion I would come to today?
Yeah.
Most of the time it's not. You're like, oh, I understand why child James thought that. But adult James looking at this, or say if you saw your nephew going through the same thing, you wouldn't say the same thing to them.
Yeah.
And so you look at the root of it, then you start bringing some different perspectives. And the other part of it in the present is identifying when that thought comes to play. You'll be surprised how often it will just pop up because you've had it since childhood.
Yeah.
You're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. And so in the therapeutic setting, helping someone identify, okay, when is this happening? Often it can be connected to something happening in the body as well. So it's okay, my body's got this sinking feeling in my gut at the moment. Okay, I'm noticing that I've got that sinking feeling connected to that thought of I'm not good enough. I know that not to be true. And this is how you start forming your new neural pathways. And so you dispute it.
Yeah.
And then you dispute it and then choose to look at the situation a little bit different. Now, I know it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not always easy, but it becomes easier over time because you've thought that way for such a long time. So, that's how I would approach it.
Yeah. And I guess like thinking about anxiety and like, you know, I kind of briefly shared the stats from before. Why do you feel that anxiety is so common now, or you're hearing more about anxiety now than compared to like maybe 20, 30 years ago? Like what's your take on that? Like why is anxiety coming up more?
I'm curious to know what you think as well, James, but my thinking is, and so I'm coming as someone who's, you know, grown up in Australia, all my grandparents born in Australia, so I can only see it from my cultural context, I guess. But I grew up with a grandfather who went to war, and you could see the impact that war had on him. I only obviously knew him as an older man, but the impact that war had on him when he was serving from 18 to 24 or whatever it was, you could see the impact it had on him and this post-traumatic stress disorder, heightened anxiety, all of those things. Yet it wasn't, and I think for many of those war vets that came back, a very common experience for them, but it wasn't talked about. There was a lot of shame about it, and it wasn't necessarily identified, and they weren't given the help probably that they needed. I'm not sure that anxiety is necessarily more prevalent today than ever before. I think it presents in different ways, but I think we're in this current, you know, in 2024, we are living in this space where there's a lot of diagnoses and people are getting, there's a framework for understanding, like, I'm experiencing this, where does it fit with this whole spectrum of what could be going on for me? So I don't think it's necessarily that the prevalence has gone up. I just think we're in a world where we're able to identify things a lot more, such as, you know, ASD and ADHD, anxiety, depression. We've got all these markers and frameworks to go, oh, okay, maybe I'm a little bit neurospicy or not neurotypical, and what does that mean? And then what help can I get to help me manage these symptoms?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I
think that's true. And I think, you know, at the start I mentioned like social media, because, you know, I think there probably was a huge stigma, especially when it came to maybe like our parents or our, you know, grandparents' age, like when, they just wouldn't talk about it. But then now it's like so many people on social media are talking about anxiety. And so therefore, I guess it generally makes people feel more comfortable to say like, I think I've got that too, you know. And I think, as you said, you know, we have a better understanding of it. There are more mental health professionals to help people in that. So I guess maybe it's just, maybe you're right that it's not that it is suddenly, it's appeared and where it hasn't appeared before, but it's just been more openly discussed.
And I think it appears differently in our generation than it has for others. I often say, I'm like, okay, our grandparents wouldn't talk about it. Our parent generation seem really okay with their children getting therapy and talking about mental health, but not necessarily for themselves. And our generation seems to be open about talking about mental health with their peers, sharing it on public forums such as social media, and to talk to their parents and those in the world around them about it. I would say we are experiencing our anxiety stems from different places probably than other generations have. The social media is really interesting because that really, there's called social comparison. Anxiety. And so you're either upward, you're comparing to like here or comparing here.
That's right.
And if you're doing that to form your identity or self-esteem, it's a dangerous place to be because there's some people who you're going to feel better than and there's others you're going to feel less than. And with social media, you're only presented this and it's really easy to feel that disconnect. You go, well, I'm not living up to that. So that anxiety can be, that anxiety can be present as well. But it's interesting because the life we're living, we've got so many mod cons. So you'd think anxiety should be less, right? We don't have the same kind of pressures or that perhaps our previous generations have, yet we are facing this. I think when it comes to social media, we are definitely facing something so much more than other generations have before. I should check the stats, James. I just feel like the stats for previous generations probably aren't going to be indicative of what was actually going on because of the way that people were diagnosed or talked about it.
Like that, I guess that's what happens when you have stigmas, right?
It's true.
Yeah.
I think something else interesting to note is the prevalence of anxiety through the generations and the family tree as well. And so there is an element of learned behaviour, learned anxious behaviour that you may unintentionally pick up from your parents.
Yeah. I guess like before we get into some practical stuff, knowing time is short, but just briefly, what is the difference between an anxiety attack versus a panic attack? What is there differences? Are there similarities? Maybe just briefly touch on that.
It's a really good question. Firstly, for those who have experienced panic attacks, they are awful, and my heart really goes out to any of your listeners who may have had a panic attack before. I would say one of the biggest differences between the two is that anxiety attack is often one that can build up during an anxious season or during an anxious time. And so you've got this clear correlation between, okay, my body's feeling so heightened, my thoughts are racing, I'm physically feeling anxiety at times, I'm feeling nervous, worried and concerned, connected to this one issue that I'm facing or two issues, whatever it may be. There's that clear correlation. And that can often look like disturbed sleep, increased heart rate, the increased muscular tension, catastrophic thinking, many different types of thinking, but really just that thinking of something bad's going to happen. This is going to get better. This is going to get worse. Sorry, not better. I wish. This is going to get worse. And that's kind of what an anxiety episode or attack may look like. And you may find yourself, feeling extremely overwhelmed and really struggling to get peace in your head or peace in your body. A panic attack is slightly different in that it often strikes when you're feeling safe. And so perhaps you're at home, perhaps you're with friends. You've gone through something that's been really difficult and anxiety inducing, such as maybe there's been like someone's gone to hospital or you've, there's been a car accident or I don't know, it could be many things. And it's interesting because those things may lead someone to have an anxiety attack and it may lead other people to have a panic attack. But when it comes to panic attack, you've gone through something that has probably heightened your nervous system. You've had to get through, you've been able to get through it. The situation is diffused often. Then suddenly when you're safe, your body has this panic attack. Heart rate often is increased to the point where they're like, is this a heart attack? The pain that you feel throughout your body, your blood pressure is impacted. I mean, again, it presents itself differently in different people. So I'm just talking very generalized. This isn't a diagnostic tool, what I'm sharing. But you find yourself perhaps at home or in bed and suddenly your heart rate is increased and your body is just in so much pain. and you're not exactly sure why.
Yeah.
Because you're like, but I got through that difficult thing, or that difficult thing happened 1 year ago, 5 years ago. So panic attacks are so insidious. They're really, not only are they awful to experience, because I think you can feel so out of control. You don't know when it's going to hit.
Yeah.
Some people can be at the shops and suddenly they have to be lying down on their back to help with their blood pressure, you know.
Yeah.
But you don't know where they're going to hit. So you feel very, I think there's a real sense of nervousness about when it's going to hit because you can't predict.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I've gone through all this. In 3 days' time, I'm going to have a panic attack. You may not. It may happen in a day. It may happen in 5 days. It may happen every day for a week. Like, does that kind of make sense, the difference?
Yeah.
And so with an anxiety attack, when it's connected to, you know, like a key incident, what you can implement in terms of calming your thinking, because you know what it's about. You're like, okay, I'm feeling anxious about my job and all the deadlines that I've got. Okay, I'm going to do once I've calmed my body down, I'm going to do these things to help me manage this anxiety and stress. And then it does help reduce those symptoms and you can keep going. A panic attack can strike out of the blue.
Yeah.
It can render you, honestly, like straight away, just feeling like helpless. All you can do is lie down and just feel the pain go through your body. So really scary for people. And if any of your listeners do find themselves having panic attacks, really worth speaking to your GP about that and seeking help from a trained professional because,
So
awful.
I guess to summarize, like anxiety is usually more long drawn out. You know, you're leading up to a situation, and then panic attack is just
your body just turns on you, and often a panic attack, you know, your heart rate's a lot higher. Like it goes from 0 to full, almost like meltdown straight away. Whereas, I mean, an anxiety attack can happen over 30 minutes, or it might be a build up over 2 weeks or 3 months, or
wow,
not fun.
No,
for anybody.
So I guess like moving to practicals, and we do have a few things to go through.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just probably won't be able to go in depth into them, but maybe just give some quick kind of help tools, you know. So I guess general tips and tricks to help identify and recognize and manage anxiety. So whether you have some self-assessment tools or stuff like that. So I'm sure there are people out there who are like thinking, do I have anxiety or not? Do I not? Do I not? And so, what's some kind of quick tools that they can use to probably help identify, and they're like, okay, I probably need some help with this. Yeah.
I mean, Dr. Google can be a scary place, but a really helpful place at times. And, you know, you mentioned Beyond Blue. There's many different really renowned resources out there in terms of anxiety, stress, depression, where you can do just some really quick self-assessment questionnaires to help assess what's going on for you. And it will often come out with you have no anxiety, or perhaps it's mild, perhaps it's moderate, perhaps it's severe. But it's a great way of just being able to assess what's going on for you. The other thing that I really recommend people do if you want to do a quick self-assessment is the mind, body, emotions. And so firstly, doing a body scan, like starting from the top of your head down to your toes. Am I feeling? Like, how are my muscles feeling? Am I feeling what's happening in my tummy? What's happening in my jaw? What's happening in my neck? Just assessing, do I feel like I've got some anxiety at the moment or stress? Then moving to emotions. And there's this, you can Google an emotion wheel. It's got maybe 30, 40, 50 different emotions. And just looking over the emotion wheel going, okay, what emotions are present for me at the moment? And it's actually, you think you know exactly how you're feeling, but sometimes you look at the wheel and you're like, maybe I'm actually feeling like 5 emotions that are sitting in the sad category. I thought I was just angry, but actually I feel like it might be sad or fearful. Or happy. It's always a good day when you resonate with all the happy emotions. And then just moving on to your thoughts, just thinking about your thinking. What thinking patterns am I using at the moment? Am I catastrophizing? Am I thinking about one thing and just like really getting it to the nth degree and can't just obsessing over it? Are my thoughts quite balanced? And, you know, are my thoughts a negative Nancy, or are my thoughts being kind to myself? And often just doing those 3 things can help you assess where you're at. And you're like, oh, this is interesting. I'm feeling it in my tummy. I've got these fearful emotions and I'm playing over a certain situation in my head time and time again. And there's some little key indicators that anxiety, you might be experiencing some anxious symptoms. Now, there's a difference between diagnosable anxiety and anxious symptoms, I would say. I think everybody will experience anxious symptoms at times. But that just helps highlight what's going on for you.
I guess like for those who are maybe on like not to the point where it's like I'm feeling something, I need to find out what it is, but maybe they're just like very much on the borderline of like what are some common things that, you know, and at that point it may or may not be anxiety at all, but just some symptoms, common symptoms that people may experience that may be indicators. Like what would some of those be that then they can be more aware rather than just like, oh, it's probably nothing, and then it gets out of control.
I think our body lets us know. So I think if we are noticing our breathing, our heart rate, muscular tension, what's happening in our gut, how we're feeling about situations, I do believe that can really reveal a lot. I think sleeping patterns, sleep, if we find ourselves struggling to fall asleep, waking up early, if in the middle of the night you're awake and like, okay, what about that? What's going to happen? So sleep can really be an indicator. Motivation. If you're finding your motivation is suddenly not there as much for a longer period of time at work, I mean, it could be something to do with depressive symptoms, or it could even be that you're reaching a burnout stage where anxiety, you know, you've been in that state of hyperarousal for too long. And I think also in terms of how we connect and relate to people, if we find ourselves snapping more, feeling frustrated by people more, just not feeling like our best selves, that can also be really indicative of maybe something else going on below the surface. The hard bit is you don't often recognize it, especially at the start of your journey. And you're like, well, maybe I'm just a bad person, or maybe I just can't cope, or I'm weak, or and so most people can identify what's happening in their body, their sleeping patterns, their eating patterns, their way they're treating people, and that can just give a couple of little like moments of perhaps it could be something else. And then if you're noticing that, that's when I would be doing either talking to a GP or doing a self-assessment, maybe asking your family or friends, hey, I'm experiencing this, what have you noticed? And then having that conversation about whether it's something you can bring under control or whether it's worth getting some extra help.
Now, like when we were chatting about preparing for this episode, you mentioned dress rehearsing tragedy.
Yes.
So, why don't you unpack a little bit about what that is and how that can help people?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm curious whether like perhaps your listeners have heard of this term before and perhaps they haven't, but it was something that's been really helpful for me to think about. And it's when you know, for me, I'll share a little bit of where my anxiety can pop up at times. And since I was a little girl, was this fear of what happens if something happens to my mum? What happens if my mum dies? And so much of my anxiety was around, okay, what will I do? My nightmares, whatever was going on, just this very hyper awareness of how upset I would be and devastated I would be if she were to die. And this was something that continued into teenagehood and adulthood. And when I was chatting to my therapist about it back in my 20s, that's when she introduced me to this concept of dress rehearsing tragedy. And so pretty much the premise is that often anxiety leads us to dress rehearse tragedy. So in our head, I start thinking like, okay, if my mum dies, how will I feel? What will my life look like? And it sends me into a spin of like heightened concern, a lot of tears and sadness, devastation at the thought of how awful that would be, playing out all the different scenarios of what it might look like, when it might happen, and the awful impact it would have on my life. And she said to me, she's like, Sarah, if this was to happen tomorrow, if your mum was to, you get the phone call to say, your mum's just passed away in an awful accident, is your response going to be, oh, don't worry, I've spent the last 20 years worrying about this. I've thought of every possibility. I've already processed it. Yeah. I'm fine. Yeah. I'm going to be okay. It's like, no, dress rehearsing all of that tragedy actually doesn't help you when it hits. And so that really helps me bring my anxious thoughts in line. So when suddenly that thought may pop up of like, okay, what was if it's like, okay, this has not happened. Thinking about this does not actually help prepare me. It serves no purpose right now. You get to you help dispute the thought with that and capture it and kind of go, I'm not going to waste my energy thinking about this because it serves no purpose except to make me feel extremely upset in the present moment. So I thought that was a really cool analogy, this dress rehearsing tragedy.
Yeah. But I guess it kind of leads to the next question, which is like experiencing anxiety maybe for the first time or like being prepared, not being prepared. So something you said was that, we're not really taught, like school doesn't teach us how to identify often anxiety and correct anxiety. And so therefore when we experience anxiety for the first time, though I don't doubt that most of my listeners probably have already experienced anxiety before, but maybe if you haven't, or they have younger siblings, or they have, people that they know who haven't experienced anxiety, but suddenly it's just this overwhelming sense of like, how do I feel? What do I do? But then you feel isolated because you're just like, I shouldn't be feeling this way. So I guess like maybe you can, how do you navigate that, and maybe speak a little bit about how, like experience anxiety for the first time and how we're not taught how to deal with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be such an isolating, scary experience when you are most likely having like a bit of an anxiety episode or attack. Often you have experienced anxiety in the past, but you haven't identified it because you don't have those tools to be able to identify what is actually going on for you. So it can feel quite overwhelming. And when you have lived in this body for as long as you have, say, and you're experiencing anxiety as an adult, you can feel a bit betrayed and going, well, what's happening here? I don't know how to help this. All I know is I feel awful, and perhaps this is the way that I've just got to live life now. Yeah. Perhaps like you look back and go, oh, when I was a child, I was fine. And like, but that was just for childhood. And now part of being an adult is living with this kind of pain. The identifying it is really hard. I think that's one of the beauties of social media and this current very open narrative around anxiety, depression, because people are sharing and so people can relate a little bit more. I think during COVID, especially for us, like, so we're obviously based in Melbourne, we had quite a few lockdowns in Melbourne and they were really difficult. Yeah. And I felt like during that time, when we asked people how they were doing, it was less the like, oh, I'm doing really well. Like, I'm doing amazing. Life is awesome. Because sometimes that's how we want to, that's the way we think is the best way to cope with anxiety, is to pretend like everything is okay. But as we went through this collective experience together, and it didn't matter, I think, if you were introverted or extroverted, or as time went on, it became really difficult. And people were, in my friendship circle anyway, were a lot more open with how much they were struggling. And I think especially in terms of anxiety, perhaps depression, they were more open with how they were doing in terms of their mental health. And it became, when someone said, oh, I'm awesome, like we've gone into our 6th lockdown, they're like, oh, I'm loving life, it's so good. We actually gave them a bit of a side eye, like, but what's actually going on for you? But I feel like the discourse got a lot more, people were a lot more willing to share, and because everybody if you shared you were struggling, you weren't going to face from anybody, oh, I can't believe you're struggling. It's totally fine. Like, why don't you just not feel anxious about it? There was so much empathy because we went through this shared experience. And I think perhaps post us going through that in Melbourne anyway, the narrative around mental health, I think, has continued to increase. And there's a perhaps also I wonder if people can relate to maybe if they find themselves feeling anxious now in 2024, that there are some similarities to what they may have felt during lockdown as well, and it helps them identify it. I'm not sure. Like I'm just curious about that. But I think with the narrative increasing, the shame being lifted, it's helping people not feel so isolated with it. Which is great.
That's a good thing. Yeah. I guess like shifting to kind of faith and how anxiety works with faith.
Yeah.
I guess my first thing is that I think often Christians might find it hard to reconcile being a Christian and having anxious thoughts, because obviously it's very clear in the word, that Christ is the Prince of Peace. Right, he is. It says, "Do not fear. Cast all your anxiety on him, for he cares for you." Like you have all these scriptures of like, okay, we shouldn't be anxious, but then we feel anxious, And so, as Christians, maybe can we be anxious? Is that a possibility? And how do we then navigate and reconcile these feelings of like, because of Christ, we can have peace, that we don't have to worry, we don't have to stress, we don't have to have anxiety, but on one hand we are still human, we have these thoughts. So how would you address that, and like how can we reconcile that?
I think this is like a really common issue that a lot of Christians can face, and unfortunately it can lead to an element of shame, them feeling like, well, I'm a Christian, which means do not fear, Jesus is the Prince of Peace, yet here I am with symptoms of anxiety. There's this gap. They can feel like there's a gap between the two. Therefore, what is wrong with me that I am not in this perfect place of peace? What is wrong with my faith? How does Jesus feel about me if I am actually here? And so you can kind of see how people can feel discouraged. And I do see this a lot with my clients. They can feel this sense of discouragement in terms of their faith, because they're struggling with anxiety. I had a friend recently share, and I thought it was a really interesting insight that, that verse, cast all your anxieties on him. It doesn't say, do not ever have any anxieties. It's this instruction to cast our anxieties on him. And I thought just that wording was really fascinating to me. It kind of has this presupposition that perhaps we will experience anxiety. What I love about being a Christian counsellor is obviously there's many different therapeutic approaches you can take when it comes to anxiety, but one of the things you do in the room is you look upon what strength and support systems do they have in place. And Christians often, faith is a really big support system to them. Yet when they're struggling with anxiety at the start, it feels like instead of it being a support system, it becomes a place that brings about some shame. And so helping them be able to see that actually Christians do struggle with anxiety, and the stats are the same as what they are for the rest of the world. Read through scripture, read through some of the Psalms, read through, like, can you see some anxiety present for some of the heroes of our faith? And so helping just bring some, like, you're not alone. You're not alone. You're not a bad Christian if you experience anxiety or any kind of mental health condition. It's not a reflection of how Jesus feels about you, but I do think it's an invitation to cast our anxiety to him and to use our faith as a support system during this time of healing or seeking help with our anxiety. I love that Jesus, one of his names is the Prince of Peace. How beautiful to know that as we can cast our anxieties on him, that he can offer us peace.
I really love that summary of just like, cast. It says cast all your anxiety on him. Cause it's like you have it, but just don't carry it with you, and like give it. I love that. That's so good. And like speaking of Prince of Peace and peace, I saw this Instagram post randomly, and it was like someone who almost broke off their engagement 2 weeks before the wedding because she didn't feel peace. And so that was like the tagline. So you have to kind of read. But yeah, she realized that what she wasn't feeling wasn't a lack of peace, but rather a flood of anxiety. And so she said, I had to learn that the presence of anxiety doesn't mean the relationship lacks peace, right? And so I think as Christians, we're often told that when we're trying to make a decision, that we need to seek out peace, or that for God to give us peace. And so, I can see and understand that if you're engaged, you're about to get married, but then you feel that it's like you have anxiety, but then is this anxiety or is it a lack of peace? And it's like, am I making the wrong decision? And so I guess, like, when making those decisions, how do you know what is anxiety, and how do you know what is God telling us as like no by not giving us peace? Like, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, that is such a good question, James. So fascinating. I think that because you're right, we're often told as we make decisions to, seek peace as we make a decision. Yet when we look back, I guess, in Scripture, was peace always present in everything God called people to do? You're the theologian or the theology expert, not me. So I'm curious to know what you think. But yeah, this difference between peace and anxiety. And I guess what's really hard is when we are experiencing anxiety and our fight or flight or our nervous system is just, misfiring and really doing everything. It's really hard when we're feeling everything within us heightened to experience peace at the same time as anxiety, right? Like the peace and the anxiety. I think when it comes to making decisions, I don't think peace can be our only framework for making a decision. I think it is an important thing to consider because I think God can speak to us through discernment and wisdom, and he can give us a sense of peace. I think back about my decision to study counselling. It was everything I didn't want to do necessarily, but I really did have a deep sense of peace and knowledge this was the way that I was to go forward. But I also had wise counsel. I had also looked at, my living situation, my finances. Did it fit with that? Did it fit with what my skill set was? There's other things to be making other things to also consider when it comes to making a decision. I think it can't be the only thing. I also think when it comes to this anxiety versus peace, it's quite a big decision to get married, to move house, to change careers, and having these thoughts of, oh, but what if? Is this wise? Asking those questions is not a bad thing either. And asking questions doesn't mean that you have anxiety either. It can really help us make a holistic decision, I guess. But I'm curious to hear from you, James, because you've got more of the biblical knowledge. What would you say when it comes to this difference between?
I wouldn't call myself. Even though I'm a pastor, my recall memory is actually really bad. So I can't actually think of any specific examples. I think you're right in a sense that, one example that comes to mind was Jesus before the cross, right? And he was the Bible describes that, he was, sweating or, to the point of bleeding, right? And so obviously it was a big distress for him. And he's he didn't want to do it, right? But then he still submits, right? And so obviously the Bible doesn't necessarily go into Jesus had anxiety or anything, but it does give you an insight on how he felt about it. He really didn't want to do it. He was if it's your, take this cup from me, but less your will, not my will, but your will be done, right? And so it's that thing of yes, even though I feel all these things, I still submit to what you are asking me to do. And so I think, that's kind of an example that comes from Scripture, but I think what you're saying is right, that I think we can't only use peace. I think sometimes peace may be the only kind of confirmation that we have, but I think it is also wise to seek other forms of assurance or kind of confirmation. So as you said, wise counsel. Something that the person on this Instagram post said was that she said when she realized that there was enough evidence that this guy was a good guy, that he was a guy who walked in faith, that there was certain things that even though I feel this way And let's just say it's the wrong decision, he's still a great guy. And so it's like, I think that's what she was trying to focus on, saying that, there is enough evidence just by how I feel. And I think what you also said is true, that when marrying somebody is a huge life thing, like especially if you have, still living with your parents and stuff like that, you're moving out, as you said, and you're combining lives, that's a whole new thing. And it's like, it can be anxious, or it can, stir up things of just like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to do this? Right. That doesn't mean that you're marrying the wrong person. Right. And I think that's a normal thing. So I think, I think, as you said, very much so, good counsel is really important. Seeking God, obviously, in that process. And sometimes God will speak through people. Sometimes he'll speak through scripture. Sometimes he will just speak to you, And so I think it's that process of just submitting it to God and being obedient regardless of how we may feel, just like Jesus,
good.
Like, I think there are definitely moments where we have to make decisions that it's just like, I don't know if I want to do that. I think maybe I can share on a personal note. So going to ARG, like maybe backtrack. Okay, so going to and I've shared this on my podcast before, but I went to a Christian singles conference, which then led me to go to ARG. But I did not want to go to that I had social anxiety. Like that came back, like because I would used to go through moments where I would not want to go somewhere or like really don't want to do something to the point where I would just like not do anything. Like I'll just sit in my bed. And so it came back and I was just like, I really don't want to do this, God. And so it's just like having like a what you call it? That kind of haggling or like that kind of discussion with God. But I think it was that obedience to like, for God to say like, hey, I think this is really good for you. This is going to be good. Like, I want you to do this. And so it's then submitting to that obedience and to know that he will take care of things. Yeah. If it's really bad, that's still okay. And it's like, I can come home and I'm going to survive still. And so, I think it's just submission to God is important. And to just have the evidences and have that counsel around you to make that decision.
Yeah. What I like, something I just noticed you said, James, was that so social anxiety was present. It wasn't necessarily an easy thing to go along to that conference, and you knew it. You probably did have a sense of apprehension and nervousness as it led into it. But what I can hear you saying is that you thought about it in the present moment cognitively. Yeah. We're like, okay, well, what's the actual worst that can happen? Oh, then I can leave. Yeah. I can drive home. Yeah. If I'm sensing that this is something where God wants me to go, okay, let me take this first step. Yeah. And there's ways to get out, but you were able to think about it cognitively, not let the feelings overtake and go, no, but this might happen and that might happen and da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. You thought about you thought about it and you were able to, I guess, rationalize with yourself. Yeah. And it probably didn't mean that you walked through the doors of the building like, hi, everyone, I'm feeling amazing.
Definitely not.
No, you probably still walked in with like some nervousness, but knowing that there was a way out if you needed to as well. And so well done for doing that. It's hard. Yeah. It's really hard when you're feeling it all here and you'd rather not. Yeah. Do you regret going?
100% no.
Really?
Like, so good because, like, it's, as you rightly said, like, it's that overthinking of thinking the worst thing that's going to happen. But when I went there, it wasn't that bad. Like, sure, there were moments where it was like, oh, I'm just kind of sitting here, like standing here awkwardly because literally the first thing they got us to do, which I had no idea, because I thought it goes straight to a session of like worship. Nah, it goes straight into like a session of mingling. And I was just like, I did not expect this. And I was like, okay, now I'm in this awkward situation. But I was just like, I'm going to try. Yeah. And like, worst case, I can just leave if I'm not feeling it. But it was good, and like happened to meet. Shout out to Sam.
We love you, Sam.
It was one of my first people I met, and had a great conversation, and led to Flow and led to ARG. So, God was, in a way, when I think about it, like God was gracious. He knew that we were going to have that conversation, but then so I would never be able to step into that if I didn't put aside, if I didn't cast my anxiety onto Him, and to just be obedient to that. Yeah.
The other thing that I like that you said that I think might be really helpful for your listeners as well is that, with anxiety, obviously, it doesn't mean that you're always going to feel fully comfortable. There are some elements of feeling uncomfortable. And I think what can be helpful to do in the present moment is kind of what you just said. You're like, okay, I'm standing by myself. This feels uncomfortable. I'm not enjoying this feeling, but I'm okay. It feels uncomfortable, but I am safe.
Yeah, that's right.
It feels uncomfortable, but I'm not at threat.
Yeah.
And doing some of that self-talk can be really helpful of, it's not that you're like, I feel amazing about everything all the time. It's nervousness is present.
Yeah.
Thank you, body, that you are trying to prepare me for maybe something that may not be great, but I'm going in informed, I've assessed the risk.
Yeah.
I've heard the smoke alarm going off. I've assessed the risk. It's just toast that's burning.
Yeah.
It's annoying. I hate hearing the alarm, the smell of, actually, I don't mind the smell of burnt toast. I don't know if that makes me crazy, but like, I actually don't mind it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel pleasant, but you're able to do it. So well done for doing that. And James, we would have never met.
No, that's
if
true.
you didn't do that.
That's so true. I would never have gone to flow church. Yeah.
Never would have gone to KL together.
That's right. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. I saw another Instagram video, and by
You got to get onto TikTok, James. You're revealing your age by talking about Instagram Reels too much.
On TikTok, but that's all right.
I mean, shout out to James. He filmed a TikTok for me,
That's
so I
true,
highly recommend his skills if you want to hire him.
So this guy, so Instagram video, and this guy's Will Chung. I think he's like a pastor in somewhere in the States, maybe, I don't know. But he talks about two types of anxiety: choice anxiety and identity anxiety. So I'm just going to choice anxiety. So he talks about how we have this new kind of, like, because we're in this day and age where we have so many choices, like we look at, like, on the basics, like you go to a supermarket, there's so many choices. Social media, we have so many different choices of who to watch or like reels to look at. Netflix is what he identified was like just surfing. Like we spend more time trying to find something to watch on Netflix. Then we realize that, like, oh my gosh, an hour's over. It's time to sleep. It's like, what do we do with our time? It's because there's so many choices. And that leads to then the fear of making, like, we need to make the perfect choice. So it's that thing of like, when there's so many choices, like, you know, eating out and stuff like that, we get stuck with fear and like anxiousness, right, on making decisions. And so I think that is also something that is maybe more, I don't know if prevalent is the right word, but it's something that is something, because we have so many choices now than ever before, we have this choice anxiety. So maybe what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
I mean, I think choice anxiety can lead to decision fatigue. So we can feel a bit stuck going, well, how do we make the right decision? And it gets to the point where, like, I've made so many decisions over the course of my day, I just can't think about anything else at the moment. I think that if that's something people struggle with if they're feeling overwhelmed, if they're feeling that there's not a sense of excitement of like, oh, look how many choices there are on Netflix, but a sense of, oh, how do I choose? And I'll watch 2 minutes of this and 2 minutes of that, and I'll read all the reviews. And like you said, end up spending more time trying to choose than actually enjoying. I'd be asking myself, is this impacting my life in a positive or negative way? Does it feel a bit, is it just that I'm tired and it's hard to make a decision, or does it feel like it's debilitating and I'm getting to the point where I don't want to make a decision again? I think there's that whole spectrum of how it may be. There is this sense of wanting to always make the right decision. I think rightly so in some cases, such as marriage or houses or those big things. But if it's coming up even over I'm not trying to downplay, but some of the more little decisions. What do I have for lunch? What color do I paint my nails? Where do we go for dinner? I think do a little bit of a self-assessment and ask yourself, do I find these things a bit hard? Is it causing me pain? Is it causing, is anxiety present in this? And I mean, just if that is something you struggle with or anybody struggles with, having that insight can be helpful, because then you can actually spend some time going, okay, well, what do I want my framework for decision making to be? How can I best make decisions? And it may sound like it's a bit of overkill, but there is something about thinking about your thinking, helping set up new patterns to help you with your thinking and decision making that can be really helpful. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what do you think, James? Do you ever get that choice anxiety?
100%. Like, I think it's, especially, I think for me, it manifests more in like choosing entertainment. And I think it's partly related to, it's kind of like that chasing that like a new dopamine high. Cause it's like, and I think it's exasperated with the use of social media, especially Reels, Shorts, TikTok, where it's like a constant flurry of, you're just constantly being presented with something new. And so therefore trying to watch something either that, because I used to, if like people who know me, I used to rewatch movies like all the time. Like my most rewatched movie, which I used to say is like my favorite movie, was The Martian with Matt Damon. I watched that movie probably like 20 times, and I would easily be able to rewatch it. It's so hard for me to rewatch it now.
Really?
And I was just like, why is it so hard? Like, I love this movie. And I think it's because like my brain is just trying to chase something new.
Interesting.
And it's like, I can't appreciate things that I used to appreciate. And it's like, rewatching movies is such a difficult thing now. And I think it's partly related to choice anxiety because I know there are so many things out there, but it's like, I don't want to like choose something, you know. It's so funny. Like, and maybe, I hope I'm not the only one who does this, but like on Netflix, I look through stuff and I add it to my list, but I don't actually watch it because it's just like, oh, I want to watch that, but I'll watch it later. Like, I don't feel like watching that now. And so I think one of the things is maybe just like pre-decide and just say like, you know, no matter how I'm feeling, I'm watching this tonight and I'm going to like put down the phone. I'm not going to like, and I think multitasking doesn't help too. Cause like you're on your phone doing something else and then you're trying to watch, you know, it's not great. So I think for me, choice anxiety is definitely there, but I think it's trying to simplify choices. I remember something that I heard once was, I don't know if you know Steve Jobs that well.
I mean, best friends when he was alive. No, I've heard of Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs always wore the same thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he said, or someone similar, but effective is like when I reduce that choice of like, what do I wear? He frees himself up to actually think about the other things. And so it's like, that's something that he's pre-decided that I do not worry about what I'm wearing. I'm just going to wear the same thing. And obviously some people are like, you can't, like, that's so ugly. Why would you do that? But I mean, it works for him because like, he's like, you know, I need my brain power to run my company. And so I'm just going to pre-decide. So I think there are definitely things that we can do to help pre-decide for our lives so that we don't go through, decision fatigue, choice anxiety, where we feel like, oh no, we have to pick the most optimal thing. I think it's overthinking that, oh no, like, I guess it's bringing yourself in the moment. Like, so what if I pick the wrong thing? Like, what if I pick sure, this restaurant could be a 10 out of 10. This one, maybe 8 out of 10. What's wasted, if I pick the 8 out of 10? So what, And it's like, is it that bad? Whereas I think we're trying to at least chase like what is the most optimal thing when it's just like, just decide, just choose one, enjoy it. And, but it's a lot easier said than done. Yeah.
It definitely is. Interesting, the insight you made that it feels like it's like chasing a dopamine hit there as well, which is a whole nother like layer to what, when it comes to choices as well and getting the most bang for your buck. And when it's like the relaxation time or the time that's just for you wanting to maximize that. And that can lead to, well, I want to make the best choice. What is the best choice? I'm not sure. I will try this. I will try that. That's also really interesting. Yeah.
And I think it just leads to maybe just having gratitude for what you do have rather than, because then it's, I guess it's the whole minimalistic lifestyle, right? It's like have less so you have less choices so that you can just appreciate the simple things. Yeah. Anyway, that's a side thing.
No, I like that. I like that.
Yeah. So the other thing that Will Chung also talked about was identity anxiety. So I'll just kind of give a spiel on what he says. So he says, nowadays there is so much pressure to find our primary identity in everything and something other than Christ. Like the world is pushing us to do that. But he says that identity really comes from dignity. So dignity is like what you're worth. And identity, we often like nowadays identity is such a, I don't know, is it a buzzword? It's something that is like, I identify as a left or like a right wing. I identify as straight. I identify as gay. And so there's a lot of things that like we identify, like I'm Asian, I'm Caucasian. So identity is a huge piece in our society. But what he was saying is that before any of that, you have to remember that we are like, I'm a follower of Christ. That is my primary identity. And if I don't get a strong sense of identity that transcends culture, then I'll forever be tossed with the waves that cause a deep anxiety that leads to depression. Because it's like, who am I? You're constantly trying to figure out, who am I? And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with today. Like that practical sense of like, the world is trying to say, I'm this, but I don't know if I feel that, but ultimately we can, as Christians, we can say, no, we are a child of God. And that transcends anything that we are. And so I really love that, how he just really puts that nail on the head, just like, we are a child of God. I'm a follower of Christ before any of that. And I think sometimes we put those things above that, unfortunately, that, I am, right wing, I'm left wing before I'm a follower of Christ. And it's like, well, then there's a disorder there, But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that, in this current age that we're living in, I hear what you're saying. There is this strong, we are living in this world where we are self-identifying more than ever before.
Yeah.
But what we can identify in when it doesn't come to faith can really swing. Like something that's in now might be considered completely politically incorrect or not appropriate in the future, and that can swing.
Yeah.
And I think if we're putting our identity in that, then that can be dangerous. I think also if we are looking so internally all the time, maybe driven by ego a little bit, this kind of self-importance part of the ego that then is like, oh, well, guess what? I am CEO. Guess what? I am, I'm a pastor of a church. And our title can become our identity.
Yes.
We see it when we meet people for the first time. What do you do? It's a really interesting question we ask people. We're like, oh, what do you do? Then we talk, because that's kind of, we can kind of gauge, and it's the identity piece. Yeah, at a funeral, we don't often talk about their job. If someone passed away and you're like, oh, Dave passed away, I'm like, what was Dave's job? What was his title? What did he do? And so it's interesting. We're living in this world that like in person sometimes our title, our identity, how we identify can be so important, feels like it's so important. But the other side of it is it's the person who we are, the values we live out, that is actually kind of what we are known for or remembered for. How beautiful. I loved what you were sharing about faith. What a beautiful aspect of faith that our identity truly does come from who God says that we are.
Yeah.
And as we keep that center, as we meditate on that, as we allow that to, I guess, sink into our spirit and our thinking and our core identity, I think that's transformational, isn't it?
Yeah,
and the other stuff can just fade away.
Yeah.
It's like, number one, I am a daughter of the King. I'm a child of God. I'm a co-heir with Christ. All these beautiful things that the Bible and God says about our identity. And it's really easy to be swayed by the world and feel like, oh, I feel better because I can say, this is my job. Yeah. This is what I've done. You should respect me because you understand what these letters mean. But actually, as we lean into that, and I think a deep peace can come from that as well, this knowledge of who we are in Christ.
Yeah. I guess like rounding it off now.
Yeah.
In regards to like your counselling sessions and what do they look like? So
Yeah.
I guess like, how do you maybe just in I don't know, maybe in a paragraph or so.
Yeah.
How do you tend to approach your counselling sessions, and like what can people expect if they have a session with you?
Yeah, great question. People can feel an element of anxiety
Yes.
and nervousness
Yes.
coming into
Yeah.
deciding to start therapy. And I often say to clients, hey, you've made the hardest step,
Yeah.
which is to reach
right.
out,
Yeah.
is to acknowledge that there's something going on and that you feel like you need some outside help, and to actually reach out and book in that session. You've done the hardest step.
Yeah.
In terms of, what my sessions may look like, there's an initial assessment session, which normally goes for 90 minutes, and that's where we get to know each other. You talk about what the presenting issue is, why, like how you've ended up coming to therapy, what's caused you to get to this point, and this issue that you're facing or issues, how is it impacting your day-to-day life? What impact does it have on you physically, emotionally, within your family, your friendship circle, work? Like we do this really big assessment.
Yeah.
And then at the end of it, it's coming up with, so James, what is it you're hoping to achieve? It's in 1 year's time, what have you been able to achieve in counselling, like through these counselling sessions? Where do you want to go? It's not me saying, okay, thanks for telling me all that. We're really going to hone in on your 0 to 2 years, like when you're a baby, and look at attachment and only do that. If you're like, but I want to work out what are my coping mechanisms for anxiety in the present. So the client gets to decide, and then I work with the client to then come up with a therapeutic plan. And then post that, it's normally 55-minute sessions where we follow this therapeutic plan that I've presented to the client to let them know what we're doing and how we're going to get there. And then assessing when we get to the end of that about how it's gone. Often the presenting issue isn't the main issue, but you don't realize it at the time. So often you go a little bit backwards. It can feel like before going forwards. But and we usually just look at, okay, what's happening in the present, what happened in the past, and then how can we restructure some of the thoughts, as well as give you some coping mechanisms for when anxiety is present, how to really cope in the present moment. And both of those things leave you feeling equipped for a less anxious future. Yeah. And it's just such a joy to be able to do that, to see this healing take place. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of my listeners probably are Christians. And so what's your approach? Do you, in terms of because obviously you're a Christian yourself as well. So how does faith work in the counselling session?
Yeah.
Or how does it not? And, even for those who may not be Christian, can they still, approach you for counselling stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely can. I definitely don't discriminate. Part of the code of ethics that I abide by as being a counsellor is, number one, respect for anybody's beliefs and support systems. Within my sessions, I make it really clear what the role of a therapist is, and even though perhaps at my church I'm able to do a little bit of pastoral care and care for people, being a therapist is not the same as being a pastor. Yeah. And so the interventions that I use as a therapist are very much the ones that, the different therapeutic approaches. I don't use any spiritual interventions in that, to keep it really clear what my role is and then what the role of a pastor is. If a client is wanting to pray in session, they can. And I will say amen and join them in that prayer. But I personally don't pray for clients in sessions. I pray before a session and I pray after a session, because I believe God's the ultimate healer and he can do so much more than what I can. Yeah. I think what a lot of people find helpful is they come with a Christian perspective and a Christian values that they want to live by. A good therapist actually shouldn't impose their own ethics onto you, but probably everybody has got stories of seeing a therapist who's like, oh, why would you go to church, or why would you not do this, and why would you wait until you get married, or all those things that may come up. And so being able to share what you're going through with someone who holds similar values and beliefs can help the client feel at ease, knowing that I'm not going to be saying, okay, so that's happened to you, let's plot revenge. Not that a therapist would do that. So, I am pretty strict on what the spiritual interventions look like. But we do talk about, I'd be saying, so tell me about your faith. Like, how is that a support to you during this time? You've spoken about journaling can be really helpful if you considered that as well as breathing exercises or grounding or doing the other things as well. So there's room to talk about faith. It's just I am not your pastor and I won't be giving I won't be using scripture out of context or doing kind of some of like the Christian platitudes that can come up at times.
Yeah. I guess like last one, like people often find it hard to find a good counsellor.
Oh yeah,
or a good
it's
mental
hard.
health, professional to help them. Any tips to help make people make informed decisions on finding one? What's something that they can look out for if they're trying to find a good counsellor?
Yeah, it can be really hard. And it's actually one of the number one questions I get of what recommendations do you have for other Christian counsellors or psychologists? Because obviously as a friend, I can't counsel anybody. It can only be that one role as therapist. So if I'm already friends with someone, I can't be their therapist as well. But it can be really hard to find the right therapist. There is a website and I'll send that to you, James, if you want to include that in the link of you being able to find a Christian counsellor. But when you're looking for a counsellor, and especially if you're doing a free consultation or your assessment session, you as the client, you need to be assessing the therapist for, are you feeling listened to? Are you feeling that they are meeting you in your, like, are they showing empathy? A red flag would be if they're giving you advice straight up of like, oh, well, why don't you just, for example, I'm sure no one else has heard this before. Why don't you just pray more about it? Why don't you just hand it all over to God? Why don't you just not think that way? Or you should live life in a different way. So if it's some trite advice giving, I'd be really aware of that. But the main thing is the rapport.
Yeah.
How do you feel when you're with a therapist? The rapport between therapist and client has been seen as being a key indicator for the success of the therapy.
Yeah.
So if you're not feeling safe or listened to with your therapist or something feels a bit off, then I'd really suggest either talking to the counsellor about that, saying, I'm feeling this and maybe you can work on that, or trying to find another counsellor as well. So just as much as the therapist should be assessing, am I the right therapeutic fit for you, you need to be assessing, is this the right counsellor for me as I go through this? Trust your gut, feel that rapport, and if you need to find a new one, it's hard because once you finally decide to see a counsellor and then you have one or two bad initial sessions, that can be really discouraging, I have to say. But find the right one. It's going to be worth it in the long run.
Yeah. So having said that, how can people find you? How can they, if they want to interested in getting a counselling session with you, how can they do that?
Oh, thanks, James. I think the best way they can get in contact with me is through my website, www.sarahclarke.com.au. And on that website, they can book in a free consultation. I do that so that we can both assess the rapport really between us. I can assess what you're facing and if I think I could be the right fit for you, and you are also assessing with not having to pay anything. Oh, could Sarah be the right person for me? So that would be the best way to get in contact through my website.
And that's like a free 20-minute thing.
It's a free 20-minute consultation. We don't really, it's not really... No therapy involved,
It's just
but
the
it's
rapport
just
that you're
it's the
talking about.
rapport. It's the what's your presenting issue. If you come to me and it's something that I cannot help with, I will let you know. I'm bound by the code of ethics to say no. I actually don't think I'm the right person for you to see. But so that's I think most people some people just book in an assessment session straight away, and people are willing to do that too. But I find the 20-minute consultations really helpful.
Awesome. And do you do in-person, online? Or?
Yeah, both in person and online. Actually, half of my clients are interstate at the moment. So the beauty of online is that you can be anywhere in Australia and have therapy. And some people like to do the first session in person and then the rest in Zoom. It's just a combination depending on, I'm happy to be led by the client on that. And so I have a room out in the outer east in Melbourne in Bayswater. So as long as that's not too far for people. But
Awesome. Before we finish off with our typical lightning round, do you have anything else you want to talk about? Anxiety? Any last comments?
Just that if you're finding that you're someone who's facing anxiety, I know it can be really tough. It can be really difficult. It can feel really overwhelming at times, can feel like your body is betraying you, can feel frustrated.
Yeah.
You can feel like you're the only one in the world that's facing it. But my encouragement would be it's never too late to reach out and ask for some help. And I guess for some of my clients, like, oh, I've been struggling with this in my childhood and teenage years. I'm like, it's okay. Like, you're working on it in your 20s, but it's going to set you up with greater insights for your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. And so I would just say, yeah, it's not too late to be able to work on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And there's lots of relatively easy therapeutic approaches. It's relatively easy to be able to get some healing and be able to gain greater insight and coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, let's get into lightning round.
Okay.
So,
Let's do this.
so just whatever comes to mind, don't think too hard.
Okay.
First thing, okay?
Okay, I'm ready.
What's your favorite thing to do to wind down nowadays?
Ooh. Go to Bali.
I just casually, just whenever I feel like it, yeah.
That would be mine today. To wind down. Okay. I'll listen to worship music and go for a walk.
Nice. What's a book that you would recommend?
Long Obedience in the Same Direction by Eugene Peterson. Love it. Read it 4 times. Highly recommend reading it.
Are you a sweet or savory person?
Sweet. I love chocolate.
iPhone, Android?
iPhone. Android. I get so upset every time I get a green message from anybody.
What's a hot take that you have?
Ooh. I feel like I'm so uncontroversial. Like I avoid controversy. But a hot take that Michael Bevan is the cutest cricket player of all time. I don't know. I don't think anyone else thinks that.
I don't know who Michael Bevan is, but that's okay. Yeah, sure. I'll believe you. One thing that you're reminding yourself of lately/daily.
Oh, okay. Is that God orders my steps, that He is a light to my feet and a lamp to my path, that He goes before me. And what a great adventure it is to be on this faith journey, even though you're not quite sure what's around the corner.
So good. Last one. What's one piece of advice that you were given that has shaped your life?
Ooh. I feel this could actually be a quote. I think it is. Anyway, but it is showing kindness to everyone you meet because you just don't know what they're going through. And so to greet people with a smile and a listening ear, I think is one of the best ways that you can live life and show that love of, hopefully, have the love of Christ flow through me to others.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's so good to have you and to chat about anxiety. And I hope it's been helpful for everybody else. Would you mind just praying for everyone who might be listening who may be going through anxiety and just to pray for them?
I would love that. Thanks, James.
Awesome.
Oh, Lord Jesus, we pray for anybody listening to this podcast who might find themselves experiencing symptoms of anxiety or have in the past. God, we just ask, would you bring your healing to them? Would you help alleviate those symptoms that may manifest in the body, the thoughts that may go spiraling around? Would you bring calmness to those thoughts? Would you help those thoughts go from just predicting terrible futures to bringing them back into the present moment? Would you remind them that they are safe? That you hold them in the palm of your hand, that you are with them, and that no matter what the future may hold, Lord, that you will go before them. God, we thank you that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And we just pray peace for people to experience peace right now in situations, that peace that can go beyond our own understanding, Lord. We pray, would you bring a sense of peace, Holy Spirit, to those that are listening, that as they take big, deep breaths in, as they calm down their nervous system, that they would be reminded of just who you are, how much you love them, and what you say about them. And Lord, we pray for any of these rules for life we may have developed or core beliefs about ourselves that actually don't line up with the Word of God. Would you illuminate that for each of us and help us to replace that with the truth that can be found in your Word, that we're wonderfully and fearfully made, that we are co-heirs with Christ, that we're sons and daughters. So Lord, would you speak to each of us and bring your healing touch? We love you, Lord. We thank you for this opportunity of doing life with you. In your precious name I pray this. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, James.
So that concludes this episode for the JC podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Hope it's been insightful and beneficial. But if it has benefited you or you think it would benefit somebody else, please do share it. You can send them the link to the Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening, wherever you're consuming it. Please like us, please follow. It really does help support the channel and helps the algorithm as well to know that this was a helpful video for people. And also, leave us comments. I don't know if you know that you can leave us comments on Spotify, YouTube, and there's sometimes I do some polls as well. So please participate. It does help me to engage with you guys. If you want to give us any feedback, testimonies, or suggestions for future topics, you can reach out to me on my Instagram @_James Chia, or you can email me if you like to use email, jameschia.ministries@gmail.com. As I said, my prayer is always to make sure that you guys are equipped as much as possible to try to live this confusing life in this fast-changing world. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This has been the JC Podcast. Hope you have a blessed week.